So just a real quick introduction of Chris and Mike. Chris is a leader, of course, in the state and really local policy research and analysis. He's held leadership positions in D.C. at the National League of Cities and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and then also at PIPIC here in California that you guys are familiar with. Mike, of course, works with the Advancement Project and a number of their partner organizations to translate data, provide training and tools for community-based organizations to be effective advocates for local budgets that reflect the needs of low-income communities of color. So few organizations are as well prepared to discuss this matter and walk us through understanding budgets as Cal Budget Center and AP. And I'm pleased to turn it over to Chris. And let's have a warm welcome for them. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today and with us online to nerd out a bit on county budgeting. Those of you who know us and follow us know we nerd out a lot on budget issues. It's sort of the mission and purpose of the organization. But we're very excited to be here with you today to talk about county budgeting and county budgeting advocacy, which Mike and I will both be touching on in various ways over the next little bit. Let me do just a couple of things logistically for you. One is my colleague Yesenia Jameson is the one here sort of keeping all of this going right here in front and guarding the online part of this and making sure that the folks online can offer some questions. Along the way in our presentations, please feel free to interrupt with some clarifying questions. We've set up some time for Q&A at the end, but if we're showing you something and there's kind of a quick clarification you needed, more than happy to be interrupted there. If you're online, there's a part of the GoToWebinar console that has a questions panel. Yesenia will be tracking that and feeding those questions to us as well. So there's a handout at your table that I'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation. And then we've got another handout, which is a little pocket guide to what I'm going to present to you all today that's a sort of takeaway, has more detail than I'm probably going to go into, but that most of what I will say today you will have in that pocket guide in some fashion. So we've got that for you as well. So let me dive in here and just say a little bit about us at the Budget Center. We're a nonprofit independent organization that's goal is to improve outcomes for low and middle income Californians through budget and fiscal policy. So we have both the sort of budget and fiscal watchdog kind of element to our work, but we do that with the purpose of trying to improve outcomes for low and middle income folks. We're based in Sacramento. We work statewide. We're a relatively small organization, and one of the things that means is that when we talk about county budgeting work, we have to do that kind of work with partners. And so I'm really delighted to be here with California Community Foundation, with Mike Russo and the Advancement Project. They are our core partners in many ways around taking this work and making it real locally. We're a small enough organization. When we talk about county budgets, we do things like what we're going to do here today, which is talk to you in general about how the process works. And then there are folks like Mike and his team at the Advancement Project that actually do a lot more of the on-the-ground helping you with county budget advocacy and have really had the experience of what it means to walk into an LA County hearing on the budget and make the case for criminal justice reform or using savings from other sorts of reforms more appropriately. So we've tried to put a program for you here today that sort of balances the overall approach to the process and then some real life kind of tangible how it works. And you'll hear that in the second part of the program today. In recent years, we have moved to doing more on the county budget process because of changes in policy at the state level, particularly changes that have realigned a whole set of services over the last decade or so, most notably the realignment of criminal justice services in the state, from state to county level, of mental health services, and a variety of other services in that arena, and with a particular eye of helping you all as nonprofits, advocates, service providers, organizers, whatever the case may be, access those debates, understand where the access points are, and make the case for using savings or using available funds in ways that can actually improve outcomes for low and middle income Californians and for low and middle income folks here in LA County. So that's the reason that we moved into this foray. I think most of you, if you're like me, and we do this all the time and I still think this way, most of you, when you start talking about budgets, we think of buildings like this, right? LA County, LA City, You think budget and you think of sort of the government building, or if it's the state, you think of the state capitol. And that's true, but we ought to be thinking about budgets much more as something like this, about the services that are being provided to people who need those services in order to get a leg up in the world. Services like healthcare to children and seniors, low-income families, et cetera. And we always say at the Budget Center that even though we go down and get into the weeds about the fiscal side and the process side, that budgets are statements about values and priorities. And in fact, they're our biggest statement that we make in any given year as government about our values and priorities, because we put our money into a place and it's the single biggest public policy decision that we make at any given point in time. So that's my sort of pitch to start out with. Now let's do a little bit just about the basics about counties. This is going to be sort of maybe old news for some of you, maybe some surprising news in some cases, but the sort of always important to remember is that California's counties are nested within a state system. They're incorporated governments of the state, so they are subject to state law. The rules about what they're allowed to do are in state law. The allowances that they are about what they're allowed to do are in state law. And that dynamic of state and local is changing all the time, both through laws that the state government makes in any given legislative and budget cycle, and also through what happens with our ballot process and changes we make to our state constitution. There are 44 general law counties in California and 14 charter counties. Los Angeles is a charter county. That's not super important for you to understand from a budget perspective, but the difference is largely about home rule. Charter county, essentially, and most of the larger urban counties in the state are charter counties, allows them some more flexibility to control their own rules, to guide their election process, and the powers and authorities of the officers that are elected to lead the county. So it doesn't have as much implications for budget process stuff, but it does for the people who are making the decisions about that budget process. Counties have multiple roles in delivering public services. So this is a place where it always gets really complicated. I always talk about the intergovernmental system as being something that's sort of designed to be messy. That's particularly true at the county government level, where the counties deliver, in particular, health and human service programs largely as agents of the state government or as extended arms of the federal government in many instances. Programs like child welfare services, Medi-Cal or Medicaid, public health and mental health services, substance abuse, the CalWorks welfare work program, and the like. Counties also have their own local functions, their own local choices that they make about the types of services that they provide. And counties in many instances provide what we think of often as city-like services or municipal services in their unincorporated areas. So services like police and libraries and planning and road repair. So services those are the kinds of things we generally leave more function of to cities, but in the unincorporated areas, the counties provide that as a sort of provider of last resort. There's also a lot that counties do alongside those other local governments, and we have this big decentralized system of local government in this country that's particularly decentralized and complicated in California. So counties are delivering all these services next to 2,000 independent special districts across the state that are delivering things like fire protection, water, parks, lighting, mosquito abatement, all sorts of specific services. And there's over 900 school districts overlapping boundaries here across the state, more than 480 cities. All of those cities sit inside of counties. It's the one thing that's a little cleaner. There aren't cities that overlap county boundaries necessarily, but there are a lot of them, right? Particularly here in Los Angeles County. And then you've got community college districts for community colleges across the state. So you've got all these districts with overlapping boundaries, which makes the provision and the delivery of services a little bit hard for the folks that you're trying to serve. It makes it hard for them to understand, right? They don't necessarily understand why one thing is a county service in many cases, or as opposed to a municipal service or provided by a special district or the like. So helping them understand that is actually one part of the role of what you all do as you do your budget advocacy. Counties are, in all instances, governed by boards of supervisors. There's sort of one little caveat here that San Francisco is a city and a county, and so they have kind of both functions. So the other 57 counties under state law are all governed by a 5-member board of Supervisors. And because they don't have a chief executive, they serve sort of a different form of government. Even municipal governments tend to have a mayor, or they have some sort of an executive function and a legislative function. At the county level, the Board of Supervisors sort of provides both functions. So it's very different than how we think of our kind of system of checks and balances at the state or at the city level. The counties, it's all kind of happening through the Board of Supervisors. And that Board of Supervisors has to provide the sort of full array of governance, and that includes everything that has to do with the budget and the service provision, and it has some kind of judicial elements to it as well, settling claims about land use, tax-related issues. So the Board of Supervisors, which 5 people isn't a lot of people, right, for a county particularly of this size, so that's a lot of power being wielded and processes that you therefore want to pay attention to. Those 5 Board of Supervisors aren't your only elected officials, of course, at the county level. Along with the Board of Supervisors, the Constitution requires counties to have an assessor, a district attorney, and a sheriff. And a few other offices are typically filled by elections as well: the auditor, controller, the county clerk, treasurer, tax collector, and the like. So you have these other folks who are also elected, and in many cases are elected county-wide. So think about the scope and scale of that, kind of a constituency, right? In many respects, these are elected officials who have one of the largest constituencies in the country. Key player that you all need to know, we call it, for the sake of this presentation, the county manager. Here in LA County, it's a county administrative officer. There are different titles used for this role across the state. But this is basically the top administrator in each county that works with the Board of Supervisor to do all sorts of things, most notably among them preparing the annual budget for the Board of Supervisors consideration, coordinating the activities of county departments, providing analyses and recommendations to the Board of Supervisors, working with agency heads across the county to build those budgets over time and to deliver those services. And so this county administrative officer, or county manager, as it's called in some other places, is a really key player in terms of understanding how budget. So that's just a kind of a quick overview about that's all stuff that's contained within the rules that the state dictates for how counties are governed. Let's talk a little bit about just some key facts in terms of where counties get their money and where they spend their money. It's at a fundamental level, county budget, as we said, whoops, got a little funky there. Excuse me here for just a second. See if I can figure out where I am. All right. Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about where we get and spend our money here. So one thing to remember is that county revenues are where we get the money. Counties get their money from a variety of funds. It's a combination of state funds, federal funds, and local funds. That represents the fact that the county's delivering services in many instances on behalf of the state government or on behalf of the federal government and being reimbursed using different sorts of formulas and eligibility criteria. This is a look at what county revenues rolled up all together, excluding the city and county of San Francisco because it's kind of a different animal. But if you took all counties and put their dollars together, this is what the arrangement of their revenues looks like. And you'll see that about half of the dollars are coming across the state from state and federal sources. Almost about a third from state funds and another 16% from the federal funds. That looks a little different in Los Angeles County, where if you took those two categories, they add up to about 40%. That's actually pretty typical around the state. A lot of times the state and federal dollar share is smaller as a share of the big urban county budgets because, remember, these are shares. What happens is you have more local revenue sources in many instances, a lot of fees and charges that develop revenues, and so you have more of that happening in the big urban counties than you do in some of the more rural, smaller counties. And so the federal and state share looks a little bit lower. But this is what it looks like statewide. You've got another about 20%, or about, well, in this case, yeah, about 19% comes from local property taxes. So it's not just state and federal dollars. And then you've got some fees and charges and other services. That's about 9% statewide. This is another place where LA County is a bit different. Your fees and charges, the green wedge of this donut, are about 17 or 18% last I checked. So that's, you have a lot more fees and charges for services that you are using in LA County. Fees and charges for services are allowed under state law. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's things like for recreation classes, plan checking fees, safety inspections, library fines, parking fines, all the sorts of, it's all the fees, fines, charges for services that are out there, and those typically are being levied on particular activities. So that's where the money is coming from. This is where the money goes for the most part. This is the same thing as if we rolled it all up into one big category. So you've got about 28% going for public protection. That's your sheriff's departments, probation, detention, and the like. Another about 27% is for public assistance. This is for the sort of human services and safety net types of services like CalWORKs that are being delivered at the county level. And then you've got about 15% in this category that when the state controller rolls up the data, they call it health and sanitation. It's probably the weirdest category there because it kind of combines the healthcare stuff like Medi-Cal with sewers and water treatment and the like. So, but this is another place where LA County differs because you deliver a lot more in the way of local Medi-Cal services, and so your percentage that goes to health and sanitation category is actually larger than for the rest of the state for the most part. So, one of the things I'm going to talk a little bit about here quickly is just going back to the revenue piece, is understanding that inside of that revenue picture, counties don't have a lot of discretion. So those state funds and those federal funds are being determined by rules and eligibility requirements that are largely being set outside of county control. Counties in some instances have some authority to say, oh, we'll make more people eligible than state and federal government have allowed, but there's not a lot of that authority. And so those funds are largely determined by how many people you're serving across those services. I'll talk a little bit about it in a second, but the local property tax is capped, most of you know, because of Proposition 13 in 1978. So that's not a revenue source that your Board of Supervisors can trigger or mess with in a given year. And so you're largely in enterprise revenues, which I won't talk a lot about, are things like golf courses generate their own revenues, and so those go into their own pot. So that's not really something you control either. So you're really talking about those charges for services, which is the place where there's any discretion in terms of levels that your Board of Supervisors can make in a given year. So that's not to say they don't have lots of discretion about how the services are delivered and choices about who receives them, where they're delivered, et cetera. But the revenue side is really something that's hard for them to control at a large level. And I say that because to go into the next part of the presentation here, which is that state rules are largely what's determining that revenue-raising authority. So one of the things to understand here is that while counties are allowed by state law to levy a series of taxes and other charges, much of that is actually determined or limited by state law. And we've made a number of changes over the years to ballot measures, most notably Proposition 13 in 1978, but even some recent changes that we've made over the years that are limiting that authority. And yes, I do have a question. Yeah. So that's exactly what I was going to talk about next. The question was about the tax on local property taxes. So Proposition 13, which was enacted in 1978 by voters, caps the local property tax rate at 1%. And it caps the ability of that rate of the assessed value. Property taxes are based on assessed values of homes and commercial properties. It limits the amount that can grow in a given year. And so there's a cap in total on the rate and on the ability of tax revenue to grow in terms of the take that the county gets. And that applies to all local governments in California. So the counties, cities, special districts, and school districts all share in the allocation of the property tax revenues. They're collected at the county level, and then they're allocated out to the different local governments that have increments, essentially, of that local property tax. One of the things that's interesting that Proposition 13 did was it basically, they weren't sure what to do once they capped it about allocating those dollars among the various competing local governments. So basically, they just locked in place the shares that were in place prior to 1978. So in many respects, one of the little weird pieces about Prop 13 is that even though your region may have changed dramatically in the 40 years since then, the allocations between cities, school districts, the county, and special districts look the same, or mostly the same as they did in like 1976, 1977. And so that's been one of the unintended consequences in many respects of Proposition 13. But that limits the local property tax. Prior to Proposition 13, what the county could do if there was a economic shock of kind is decide to raise the property tax by some increment to raise some additional revenues. That's traditionally how local governments work. That's off the table in terms of local revenues for counties, for cities, for school districts, and for special districts. So that's, yes, sir. Right. Right. So that's a great question. The question's about if we reformed the system under Proposition 13, and there's a Make It Fair campaign that is trying to reform the commercial property side of that. We can talk more in detail about that later, but the question was about whether the allocation of that would look, what that would look like. And I don't think that's been decided. So I'm going to punt on that question a little bit, but it could be that they would leave that allocation formula the way it is now and just to say, look, we're not changing that side of it. But they could also decide to say, well, maybe we should change those allocation shares to sort of modernize them and make sure they look like the way counties look today. But I don't think that's been decided. So that's not the only local authority, of course. There are other local tax authorities: retail sales, short-term lodgings, which is essentially hotel taxes, business taxes, transfers of property, and the like. All of these are allowed, but they are constrained in a certain sense, like the local sales taxes is limited to an increment that's added on to the state. So it's not like that's an unlimited resource that counties can use. And all of those taxes are actually all taxes that matter a lot in terms of what they look like from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so when your county supervisors are considering what to do with these taxes, they're usually considering them in the context of, oh, if we raise the business tax, what does that mean for the counties around us, for the businesses that are looking to locate? So in some sense, even though they have some authority under the state government around these, they feel a bit constrained in terms of how much they can use these levers in certain instances. But they do have these other authorities. Those other authorities require some voter approval. So voter approval is required for local taxes, and it depends on whether it's a general tax or a special tax. So if it's general tax, if the tax dollars come in for general purpose uses to be allocated across the county budget, that can pass with a 50% approval of voters. If it's a special tax, a tax that would be levied and then go to a specific service, it requires a 2/3 vote of your voters. So much higher threshold for those kinds of special taxes. And there's been some changes to these laws that have made over the years, but that 2/3 vote on special taxes is a particularly tough constraint. I mentioned the charges and fees. Yes, sir. Yeah. Right.
California Supreme Court. Okay, there we go. All right. Right with BizFed. Quick question related to the California Supreme Court ruling on particular special taxes as it relates to that marijuana issue. How does that relate to this piece here? If there's let's say, a ballot initiative that's done by signature compared to what's going on in the county, does that make a big difference here?
You know, I haven't looked at the details of the legal decision there, but the key decision was essentially to say that only requires a 50% vote, essentially that it's a general tax, that the tax on marijuana is a general tax for general purpose that applies, would be a 50% vote. And so that's, in other words, not requiring that it has this 2/3 threshold on it. So for county governments looking to raise money off of the distribution and dispensing of marijuana, that's a big court decision in the sort of sense of the threshold they'll have to meet now to get over to get voter approval for those kinds of taxes and fees. So I'm going to skip ahead to a few things about the process side because I want to give Mike a chance to talk about how this is all working locally. But it's just to come back to the notion that how counties do all of this is really set within state rules. And you're going to see some of this in some details that I'm going to give in the handout afterwards. But this little infographic you have, which you can't see on the screen, but you all have it on your table. For those of you online, it's actually available on our website if you look up Dollars in Democracy on our website. So what this infographic does is describe a year-round process that is cyclical and interwoven with the state government, and it talks about access points for where you all can access the process. Now, I'm going to walk through just a few details about that real quick, and then I'll turn it over to Mike. But first, it's to understand there are rules set in place about how counties budget. So there are essentially 3 budgets that counties have to enact over the course of an annual budget cycle: a recommended budget, an adopted budget, and then a final budget. And the processes for these used to look the same for all counties, and now there are 2 options. A change in law in 2016 allowed counties to use one of 2 processes. So there's one process that's called a 2-step model that basically the short version of it is you have to pass a recommended budget before July 1st, have a hearing in the spring, and then you would come back after July 1st, which is when the state starts its fiscal year as well, and you would then put together an adopted budget. You would adopt that before October, and then you'd have a final budget that you would file with the state controller. All the counties have to file their budget with the state controller by December 1st. So that's kind of the 2-step process. Was by July 1st, which is really the start of the fiscal year, you really only have to get a recommended budget done. That's the old process, and the process a lot of the counties are still using. The new process expedites all of that and basically sort of says that you can do this in one step by having a recommended budget that you just release earlier before May 30th out. You make it available to the public. It doesn't necessarily have to have a hearing, which is what the other process requires. And then you have a hearing on a potentially adopted budget. That budget gets adopted then by July 1st. And then you have a final budget that's kind of the same version. Once you've kind of rolled everything up together and you've got a better picture of things, you can put the final budget together thereafter. This basically expedited the process and allows counties to get this done faster in the kind of April to June period. LA County has adopted that faster process. So this year's budget process, there was a recommended budget that came out in late April. There was a hearing held in June. And then a budget here was adopted on like June 25th or 26th, a $30 billion budget for the next year. So they use the expedited process. Now, one of the things to understand about all budget processes is that they are cyclical, they are annual, and so things are always happening. So even though there was an adopted budget, $30 billion in LA County, they're now dealing with a supplemental budget, which is they get a little bit better picture of the revenues that are coming in. The state has adopted its budget. They get a little bit better picture of what the state side of this looks like. And so they're always kind of tinkering with what dollars came in and how those dollars get allocated. So there's this supplemental budget process that doesn't require a hearing either, but is going on post July 1st. So, and Mike will probably say a little bit more about that. But then once over the next few months, after they've figured out kind of how all of that looks, because remember these dollars are kind of constantly coming in, that's why they create this final budget once they've got a clearer picture, and that's what they file with the state controller. It's important to note that those budget votes are 50%. So by law, it only takes a 50% or a majority vote of the Board of Supervisors, so 3 out of the 5, to pass those budgets. There are instances where they have to get 4 out of 5 votes. There are some specific pieces of state law that say if they're going to transfer money from one fund that's a non-general fund to the general fund and such, they have to do that with a 4/5 vote. There are if there's some unanticipated revenues that they then choose to allocate, there's some of that they have to maybe take a 4/5 vote on. But this budget process otherwise just requires 3/5 or 3 out of the 5 to vote. So that's the process or the things that are required by state law. One of the things to just simply understand for all of you is sort of there's budget advocacy standpoint. You're doing this year round, which is why this weird infographic that somebody in the media once called a death star, because there's a lot of information there, right? Trying to roll the budget up in one graphic is not the easiest thing to do. It's cyclical, and there's something you can do year-round. So in the sort of sense of the process, the county administrative officer in LA County is going to start asking for agencies to put their budget proposals together as early as probably January. And then there's going to be internal processes of deliberating on those proposed budgets from the agencies in the sort of February to April period. Then the CAO is going to put that recommended budget out in April. And then there's going to be a process thereafter, a hearing in June, and they're going to adopt a budget. But then they're going to have a supplemental budget. There's going to be more information that's been coming in, and they're going to start the process all back up again. So from a budget advocacy standpoint, you can access it during the sort of most heated period, which is going to be that April to June period. But if you really have big proposals that you're thinking about, one of the most effective things you can do is actually inject your ideas much earlier in that process by talking to those state agencies and sort of saying, hey, this isn't working the way we'd like it to work on the ground. If you could structure your own agency budget proposal differently in order to make this work better for us, and you can be successful at that, then those folks can actually pitch that in to the county budget. And that might be the way you get bigger change than trying to react simply to the recommended budget when it comes out in, say, April. So that's just to sort of say that it's a big, long, cyclical process, and you can do it year-round in your communications with state agencies, with county agencies and with the board supervisors. So I'm going to just stop, leave you with a couple of takeaways here, just to remember that county budgets are a lot more than just dollars and cents, right? This is to come back to that they're about values and priorities. Remember that the process is inherently intertwined with the state government. So we're all operating on the same fiscal year. The decisions that the state makes are actually filtering into and determining what the realities are for counties on the ground in many instances, and the rules and regulations around the process are also being negotiated and set by the state. The revenue side is really largely constrained. Just to come back to some of those issues around their local tax authorities, pretty limited. And the practices that the county uses are being shaped by those rules and those processes, right? The sort of having even just in the last couple of years, changed the process for expediting the county budget process is a good example of how those things are kind of constantly in flux. So I'll leave you with our final message about this is about values and priorities, and I'll turn it over to Mike Russo, who's going to talk to you a bit more about how this actually has worked in LA County, some of the issues that have been arising there, and how you can do your budget advocacy better from their experience in trying to help local advocates on the ground.
Okay, let's see. I need to pull up another PowerPoint. See where this tiny cursor is, so bear with me for a sec. That's mine. See where the slideshow. Or to the right. Just a good reminder, I need to see my optometrist sometime soon. Okay, perfect. Hello, everybody. And thanks, Chris, for doing that great job setting up the county budget conversation. I'm just going to hopefully take things from where he left off and go into a little more detail about what's happening in LA County, and also start to transition us a little bit to the conversation around advocacy. So how all of us in this room can actually start to make a difference. First, a little bit about Advancement Project California. So we're a civil rights organization. We do advocacy aimed at ending racial inequities here in California. We're based in Los Angeles, but we work statewide. We work on educational inequity issues, issues around health, democratic processes and political participation, and also around budgets. So I run our Equity and Public Funds program area, which really came about because as we were doing work in all these different areas, which are sort of the more traditional civil rights places to do work, we realized what Chris said, that it exactly is the case that budgets reflect values, and that's where the rubber can really hit the road about whether our public systems are trying to transform the inequities that we've inherited and that we all live with, or whether they're perpetuating or even making them deeper. So the work that we do is all about trying to work with organizers and advocates to help open up this black box of local budgets and start to put dollars in the equity column and make a difference that way. As I mentioned, I'm going to try to pretty quickly, so I've got time for Q&A, go through probably three major things. So I'll talk a little bit about the county budget process in Los Angeles. So, Chris laid out the big picture framework, but talk a little bit about how it tends to play out here in Los Angeles. Talk a little bit about the what of the county budget. So a pretty high-level overview, but at least show you, some of the stuff, again, Chris was talking about what's distinctive, about where our revenues come from and where our spending is going. And then maybe just share a couple of thoughts about how budget advocacy can be effective, and we've seen it play out through our work here in LA. So first, on the county budget process, I'm going to run through the players first of all, and then try to put it up on a timeline. As Chris said, it's a lot to try to capture in just one go around. So one of the first players to start with is the county CEO. This is the county manager role that Chris had mentioned. We call it the CEO in Los Angeles. And Sashi Smythe, that's her right there. As our CEO, she basically tries to coordinate and be a go-between between all the different departments and the board. And so that means that she plays a really important role in setting up the budget and the budget conversation. So, she's the one who's setting the overall framework for the budget each year. She's working with the individual department heads to develop recommendations and what the plan should look like. And based on the requests that are coming in from the department, she pulls it all together and turns it into that document that Chris mentioned, the recommended budget. Then that gets handed off to the supervisors, as we'll see in a second. They're the ultimate decision makers, but she still plays a role after that, responding to requests for more information, studies. The CEO's office does a lot of pulling together of information to help the CEO, or the board, make better decisions. And also the CEO plays an important role, like actually monitoring and implementing a lot of the budget decisions that get made so that the plan they adopt actually plays out as they're spending money over the course of the year. And one thing to note about the CEO here, there are different models of what that role can look like in different counties. And in particular, the balance of power between the board and the CEO can shift a little bit depending on, who's on the board and who's in the CEO slot. Probably like 4 or 5 years ago now, I guess, in LA, the board experimented with strengthening their CEO, giving him at the time a little more power to directly oversee departments, work with them, a little more delegated power from the board. They decided, after some turnover on the board, they don't like that very much, so they replaced him. They have a new CEO now, and now there's a little less independence, and it is a little bit more of a ministerial function, but still really important because that recommended budget does set the frame for the debate that happens later on. Next player to look at are the departments and agencies. So there's about 50 major departments, agencies, commissions with funding authority within LA County. So there's a lot of them. And, they ultimately don't have decision-making power, but they're coming up with a request. They're the ones who are saying, hey, here's how we see need in, the Department of Children and Family Services. Here's what the needs are within the jails. And then they're taking that to the CEO to ultimately shape the recommended budget. So again, as the first actors in the process, what they say they need is a really important determinant of where the conversation goes. And I'll also just say some department heads have more power than others, especially those who are independently elected and have a direct constituency. The sheriff, for example, what the sheriff says is probably going to have a little more weight than, again, some of the kind of internal bureaucrat type folks who run some of the other departments who the supervisors might feel a little more comfortable steamrolling over if they have a different view of where they want things to go. Next, we got the Board of Supervisors. Mentioned them a couple times. As Chris said, they're the ultimate decision makers. They take that recommended budget that gets handed to them by the CEO. They hold a hearing on it. They can propose changes and tweak it. And ultimately, they're the ones who are going to adopt that budget with a 3 out of 5 vote. And I have on the list here, too, that they hire, fire, and oversee the CEO, just to underline that even though the CEO has a very active role in the nuts and bolts of the process, again, ultimately, the CEO is accountable to the board. And in LA, at least, they have used that authority when they want to see things move out a little differently. And then finally, I've got the community up there, too. The community does have a formal role in the budget process. That hearing that we talked about, that is there by law because the public needs to have a chance to weigh in and say, here's what we think about this budget plan before it gets adopted. So you've got the chance to provide formal testimony, but that by itself only gets you so far. More active community engagement in the whole process can actually make it work better from the government side of things because they're more informed about what's actually happening on the ground. I think getting information into counties, as those of you who've done work with them know, can be a little challenging. And so having community members directly go to decision makers and leaders and say, hey, here's what's happening, here's what our need is, can actually make them make better decisions. It can also provide stories, information, data that can ultimately have a real impact on how they understand the impact of their funding decisions. And all that, again, goes way beyond just showing up for your 2-minute testimony, the day before they're going to try to vote on this thing. Sorry, question.
Stakeholder value. What are some tactics or strategies that we can use to implement, to get a greater influence for the community? Because, I love the slide, but it just seems like community should be on top because they serve us. And I think we forget that sometimes. So, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that is definitely how it should be. It is not how it plays out in practice, unfortunately. I'll try to get into some advocacy strategies towards the tail end, so maybe we can just circle back if I've given you some stuff to chew on by then, and if not, flag it again. Cool. Sorry, maybe one more. Oh, sure, yeah, if folks can say who they are.
Good morning. My name is Ipiani Lockhart. I work for California Partnership.
Awesome. Good to meet you. Okay, so here's trying to put that in more of a timeline so you can see how all the pieces play out over the course of the year. And I'll just try to go over this pretty quickly since I think Chris covered it pretty well. It really does start early in LA. It really is kind of December, January that the CEO is saying, here's what the framework is. Here's how much we think each department is going to have to work with. And then they do release the recommended budget in mid-April, so pretty early, by the time they've been able to chew over what the state is doing and then hopefully what the feds are doing, though that's pretty hard these days to read the tea leaves on what Congress is going to do on federal funding. The public piece does kick off at that point, so that recommended budget is a public document. There's a press conference. Anybody can take a look. And at that point, the hearing date gets called when the Board of Supervisors is going to hear testimony and start making motions about how to amend it. As Chris mentioned, they do the kind of front-loaded 2-step process where they do adopt the budget by June 30th at the beginning of the July 1 fiscal year. Then they do the supplemental budget process, which is actually happening on Tuesday because we're getting on towards the end of September. So this is the process where they figure out, okay, how did the previous fiscal year actually come in? How much revenue did we actually get? Did we spend everything that we thought we were going to? And it also sometimes gives them a chance to chew on stuff that wasn't fully digested in June in the rush of just pulling together the full budget. So it's smaller in absolute terms. So this year, the main budget was $30 billion, and then the supplemental is going to increase that by about $1.5 billion. So about 5% of the total. But that's often where policy happens and stuff that the supervisors want to spend a little more time getting right. So I think 2 or 3 years ago now, the county started up the Office of Diversion and Reentry, which is one of their big initiatives to try to better serve justice-impacted folks. They actually stood that up as part of the supplemental budget. They knew they wanted to go in that direction, but they weren't quite ready to pull the trigger on it over the summer. But then with a little more time, and I think with a little more focused advocacy, in September is when they actually took that action. So June is the main event, but there's definitely stuff that happens in September, and it's a good time to get at the table. Actually, Chris was telling me a story as we were sitting together before about a community group that really just showed up on, the day of the hearing on the supplemental, said, we're doing great work with youth. We've got this many slots. If you give us $100,000, we could basically double that. The supervisor said, okay, $100,000 isn't that much. We've got some lying around in some of these accounts. Here you go. I mean, that's not the model. You really want to start much earlier, but it can work, because there's often a lot less attention on these supplemental budgets. Again, that's sort of the government side of the process, but there are community tactics that can be impactful too. So just to list out some of the menu, definitely doing budget research to understand what the county is doing and whether it meets community needs is important, and especially seeing how your needs are playing out against the various proposals in the recommended budget and the adopted budget. You got to meet with all the different players. So that's the CEO, that's the supervisors, that's the department heads in the relevant places so that they know what you're going to ask for. And then the public hearings, I really think of as a place to kind of flex the muscles. You got to lay the groundwork. You got to let them know what you're asking for and have a good, strong proposal going in. But that's the point where the rubber meets the road and they're figuring, okay, here's the pot of money we have to play with. How are we actually going to make those decisions? Showing up big, getting all those folks in the T-shirts and saying, yeah, this isn't just me as an advocate by myself saying this. The community is behind this, and you'll get credit if you do the right thing, and you might not like it if you do the wrong thing. That's really, I think, often the role of the public hearings when, the supervisors are paying attention, the media is paying attention, but that's really the capstone of the campaign. And as you might imagine, you want to have an advocacy calendar, a plan that lines up with the public process. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but you really want to do more of your inside game research and advocacy early on in the process, and then start to go big and mobilize as you get into the public phase in the summer and fall. I mean, all things being equal, I think it mostly just comes down to the particular politics and the particular relationships you've got. I mean, I don't think people tend to be that turfy of if it's like a supervisor idea versus something that bubbled up from the department. If you've got a supervisor who can be a real champ and likes your idea, that's probably your first choice just because they've got a lot more power to just tell the department what to do, and if they don't like it, tough. But if you've got a real champion within a department, that can be a good place to start too, so that if you go to a supervisor who might be a little more mixed on the idea and you can say, no, we talked to the department, they're totally behind this, that can help maybe shift them a little bit more your way. Great. Sorry, one more. Yeah.
Hi, Efrain with CCM. Just a quick question on the budget research part, drawing on your experiences at AP, is so getting information early is the key thing. Have you had any success sort of going directly to the departments and trying to PRA their drafts of the budget, right? Because a lot of times that's a good place to start, but a lot of times they'll say it's a draft, we don't have to share it with you or anything. Just curious, what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, so I think formal PRAs, Public Records Act requests, are not going to be as useful because they are working documents. They're not going to share that stuff. But I think you can work relationships within the department. And actually having good relationships with the CEO's office is often a really powerful tool. So some of the work that we've done around criminal justice reform and reallocations, generally probation and the sheriff's department are not super psyched about sharing data with us, but a lot of that goes into the CEO. So sometimes we've been able to talk to folks we know in that office and say, hey, is there any sheriff or probation data relevant to this? And been able to get it through them. So again, a lot of it depends on relationships and what you're able to work. The formal PRA process is maybe good for stuff that's fully baked, but getting a read on where things are headed, you got to be a little more nimble, I think. Okay, I'm going to now move into some charts because those are the fun part, at least for me. So just briefly about how the LA County budget is structured. So there are basically three sort of different pots of funds that together make up any public budget. The general fund is sort of the main operating fund of the county. And that's probably most of what you think of when you think of what the county budget is. But there are also these enterprise funds, which Chris quickly alluded to. These are sort of self-contained departments that generate their own revenues, run a little bit more independently. So things like golf courses, some parks, hospitals actually in LA County are some of our big enterprise funds because they're largely funded through patient-based revenues. And then there are special funds. So these are funds that are set up with usually dedicated revenue that can only be spent on very specific purposes. And so often special districts that run through the county budget show up as special funds. So like fire districts are funded through assessment are going to show up as special funds. In LA County, the general fund's about 2/3 of the total. It's about $20 billion. So that's where a lot of the action is, and that's where a lot of the flexibility year over year is. And that just kind of says basically the same thing. Sheriff's Department and the health departments are often, some of the big general fund departments, and then fire for special funds, and then your hospitals, airports, that sort of thing, and your enterprise departments. And the last kind of introductory concept I'm going to throw out there is this idea of local revenues and net county costs. Yeah, question. I believe that's coming into a special fund. They've just kind of got a place to hold it right now because they don't have a spending plan on it yet. So some of that might get transferred into the general fund as they figure out what services they want to spend with it. But for now, yeah, I think it's just going into a special holding pot in the budget.
Yeah, I just asked them where Measure H shows up on this chart.
Yeah, that's the recent homelessness services ballot measure that we just passed last year. So local revenues are really the dollars that are coming in largely from property taxes and then a couple assessment fees, that sort of thing, which are generally flexible. So, as we'll see, most of the money in LA County, as with the rest of the county, is coming in from the feds or from the state. But the local dollars are the ones where there's a little more ability to make local decisions and allocate according to local needs. So it's a smaller piece of the pie, but it's important because, again, that's where your advocacy can potentially have a significant impact. And then the flip side of those local revenues is what's called net county costs. So if you look in the budget, each different department says, here's the revenues that we're raising within the four corners of our work, here's the spending that we've got, and if there's a difference, if they're spending more money than they're taking in through their own revenues, that's net county costs. That's how much they need to be subsidized through the county's general revenues in order to operate. So again, that's a really clean way of understanding what the local priorities are, because that's the places where they see, okay, this department has a gap. Are we going to use property taxes to fill it? Or are we going to say, tough, you got to float your own boat. No, we're not going to actually let you do that extra bit. Yeah.
Cynthia Sanchez with Oco Pico in Orange County. We work to advocate for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. Recently, we had an action to a budget hearing, and we showed up big with all our speakers and our shirts, and we got $750,000, ultimately not in the pot that we wanted. But part of our fight has been that the county uses discretionary funding to end homelessness, essentially. I'm wondering if the discretionary funding pot exists in a specific section of the budget, or is it sort of across all three?
Yeah, I mean, so discretionary funding can mean a lot of different things. Often it's in the context of like the discretionary dollars that each supervisor has in their back pocket. They each get an allocation to sort of spend however they want in their districts, which can often be on particular services in high need areas, responding to stuff that happens during the course of the year, funding nonprofits or other organizations that they like. So, that's money that has like no strings attached to it whatsoever and is firmly in control of a supervisor. And then within most departments, there's some degree of flexibility. I mean, they don't label them slush funds on the budget by any stretch of the imagination. But usually there's things called provisional financing uses, which we'll talk about in a second, where in the budget, the department and the CEO say, yeah, we're going to spend some money on something, and we've got a vague idea of what it is. Let's just put a placeholder in there, and we'll figure it out later. And often that can be slightly more flexible. And then, again, a department might know, okay, we contracted out a lot of this funding stream. There's a little bit left over, so we'll just kind of use it to respond to need over the course of the year. So, again, discretionary can mean a lot of different things depending on the scenario, but often it's those board dollars, I think, which are pretty small, but, again, totally within the reach of whatever the board member wants to do. Okay, I'm going to try to move us forward a little more quickly so we can get to the full Q&A, but hopefully folks get that, local revenues and net county costs. Here's the revenue picture for the budget that they just enacted, fiscal year 2018. And it looks pretty similar, I think, to the overall statewide picture that Chris flagged, except for those couple of differences. So the federal percentage is about 17%, states, I think, 22 or 23, and then our property taxes are 21% of the whole. So pretty big. We've got, more property value and therefore get more revenue from property taxes than a bunch of other counties. And then our local charges for services is a bigger chunk than statewide. That's about 17%. One thing I'll flag in addition to what Chris said is that a lot of that revenue is contracts through the Sheriff's Department. So the Sheriff's Department provides policing services in a lot of the smaller cities, especially like in the Southeast. And that's places where the city is spending its money to the county to get that service. And then the other is a lot of miscellaneous stuff, those special district assessments that we were talking about before. And then here's the local revenue piece. Again, these are those flexible dollars, about $7.7 billion as compared to the $30 billion of the full pie. And as you can see, property taxes are really, the biggest game in town. About 3/4 of that funding is coming in from the property taxes. And even that second kind of big blue chunk is actually carryover money from the previous year. So also probably primarily came from property taxes. So other stuff, general sales taxes, transit occupancy taxes, some, charges for services, business licenses. Those are some of those tiny little things that you got in there. But at the end of the day, property taxes are what determines how much local revenue you've got. Very good question over there.
Yeah, hi, my name is Chris Arroyo. I work with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. And my question is essentially, do you know where we stack up, even as a guesstimate, on a per capita basis statewide in terms of the allocate or the revenues that we have coming to us via the state and
on a per
federal
capita
sources?
basis?
Yeah.
I wouldn't think we're that different. As Chris alluded to, most of it is formula based. So, it really is based on what are the demographics you've got, how many people do you have, how many of them are, lower income versus higher income. And we have obviously a lot of high need folks. We also have a lot of really rich people too. So at a guess, I'd say we're probably not that far off. I don't know, Chris, if you've got yeah, but really good question. Okay, so that's the local revenue picture. And then just one kind of brief historical look. So this is what it's looked like over the last decade. Things, I suppose you could say, about the fact that most of the money the county spends is not its own money, is that they can be reasonably insulated from really big external factors. So you can just barely see the little sort of slowdown and tiny little dip in fiscal years 2010, 2011. That's the Great Recession. And you can see a little more of a dip in the local revenues, which is the orange line down below. But because there were, a lot of rescue measures like the stimulus bill that the feds passed, a lot of attempts to say, okay, we're going to try to, keep our commitment to localities, they didn't actually get hit as hard as, say cities did, who do rely on more general revenues and do need to spend a little more of their own money. Okay, here's the expenditures piece. Once again, looks pretty similar, a little more on the health side. So it's kind of about a quarter between health, social services, and human services, and then public protection coming in at about 20%. That's the whole pie. That's the $30 billion. But if you look at that net county cost category, this is where the locally generated revenues are going. That red slice, the public protection, is suddenly taking up a much bigger chunk of the pie. So it's 42% of the local flexible revenues versus only 19% of total revenues. But what that's saying is that a lot of the health services, a lot of the public, public and social services is relying on state and federal dollars. And at the end of the day, the biggest single chunk by a pretty significant measure of where the locally generated property tax revenues are going is going into public protection, jails, sheriff's department, courts. And let me just try to quickly wrap up by talking about advocacy. So hopefully you've gotten some sense, and there's been some, questions about how to actually, move this giant system. I'd say budget analysis is a really good starting point because it can help you figure out what to ask for. So that means both understanding what the county is currently doing and where the gaps are, and then figure out, what it might cost often to actually fix the problems that you've identified, as well as figuring out places where there's just not enough information. Often you start to do some research, you start to do some advocacy, you find there's not actually an answer to your question, and so the first step is for a study or for some systems to get into place to actually figure out what is going on and how the county is spending money. Often getting a better understanding of the budget can help you figure out what a strategy is and what some of the key leverage points are. So, is this a state pot of money? So actually I need to go to Sacramento first. Is this something that's within a particular department and is earmarked for particular uses? So that's the world I need to work within. Figuring that stuff out can make your advocacy more effective. And then a lot of it is just getting, the talking points and sort of the ammunition for your campaign, saying, hey, here's this funding inequity, here's this history that we've had, here's the context that actually makes this ask compelling. And just a couple last points to leave you all with, just to emphasize what Chris says, budgeting is really year-round. The cycle really takes 9 months at least, stop to start. And in between all of that, there's planning, there's the supplemental budget, which we talked about in September, and then often there are these, sort of earmarks put in place in the budget, the provisional financing uses, saying we want to spend $100 million on something, but we'll come back to it later, like Measure H, where they're, going through a whole separate process to figure out how that money gets spent. So if you want to engage in budget advocacy, don't think, oh, they just passed the supplemental this week, I got to wait 6 months. It's always a good time to jump in and start having the conversations. I will say there are often a lot of black boxes. You ask folks within the county questions that you think there should be an obvious answer to this, like, how are dollars for reentry services distributed geographically across the county, they can't really tell you that, shockingly enough. And so, again, figuring out where are some of the gaps and how can you try to work around that to still advocate, even knowing that, there are a lot of unknowns out there. And I will say that political will can cut through a lot of the stuff that's challenging in this process. The supervisors do have a lot of power, and if they are able to say, this is a priority, I want to see it get done, they can make a lot of stuff happen. So really cultivating allies on the board, as well as within the departments, can be a really powerful tool. And I would definitely, think about the political side, as always, along with the sort of nerdy green eye shades version of it. Okay, I think that's everything I had. So I think we've probably got like 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So are we doing this, Chris? I know we've got some folks on the website.
Those of you in the room with online. All right. Now, for those of you that are out there online, we will take questions out of the GoToWebinar questions panel, and Yesenia will feed those to us up here as those come in. So I see we've got one over here already.
Laura Larmendi, BizFed. I wanted to know how we can access or download the presentations that you're sharing with us.
So we'll put those up on our website at the Budget Center, and I'm sure Mike has his available as well, and Joseph and the team at CCF will also have them. I'm sure we can figure out a way to email those out to you. Yeah, ours will be up on the website as of tomorrow. Yeah, okay. And we'll have Mike's as well, which is definitely. We have another question. Yes, we'll get a.
Hi, I'm Devin Porter at the ACLU SoCal. You mentioned at the very end that there are a lot of black boxes in the budget process, and I was just wondering if you had any advice on trying to figure out like what particular line items mean, or when you're trying to do kind of this research in the budget analysis stage, like where do you look and what do you kind of do to try to figure out what things mean?
Sure, that's a really good question. There's not really one size fits all answer, and actually one of the fun things is that like different counties use slightly different terminology for the same thing often too. So working multi-county as we do is kind of a fun process because you think you know what a word means, but it turns out they're using it completely differently. I will say that this is a place where having folks within the county who can help you out can be really powerful. So where we've run into some of those roadblocks and black boxes, having the ability to talk to folks within the CEO's office and, just straight up ask, or, within the Board of Supervisors, if they ask a question, they're also very likely to get a response, probably a little more rapidly. So I'd say that that's one category of black boxes, just, you need to figure out what something means. The other category is, these places where there just aren't systems or metrics set up to answer the question the way that you want it answered. And that's also a place where if you can get like a motion out of the Board of Supervisors, like a study. I mean, often I know we poo-poo studies because that's like, oh, we're not actually taking action, we're just grinding our wheels. But sometimes that can be the key thing to do, to just say, okay, let's get our CEO and our auditor controller to dive deep into something and get some more info and start building the will for change.
And I wanted to follow up on that real quick. One of the places that can seem like a black box is the budget documents themselves. They are not, even though there have been lots of efforts over lots of years to try to get local budgets more transparent in terms of the information. And for the most part, they do a good job. Like the charts Mike was sharing with you are right there on the front page of the LA County budget website. And the summary documents are often pretty good about telling you what policy advances the supervisors think they've enacted in a budget. The difficulty is a lot of times what you're going to be going and looking for are sort of wanting to know some line item type things, and those can be really difficult to find. My organization was working with a lot of folks after Proposition 47 passed to try to figure out what was happening at the county level. That became a huge issue, of course, here in LA County. And you couldn't just go into county budget documents and find something simple like how many folks were let out because of Proposition 47, and so what did the overall bed population rate decline by, and are there dollar savings from that? Like the basic question you'd want to ask about Proposition 47. Most counties didn't have that kind of reporting built in, and so you have to ask for it. So a part of budget advocacy is what Mike was saying, is asking for the information you need, and asking and asking and asking again, and then if you don't get it, doing what you need to do to force them in some instances to provide the information if they're not doing it.
Hi, good morning. My name is Leticia Colchado. I'm actually with the Chief Executive Office, member of the Homeless Initiative team, and I just wanted to confirm and kind of clarify one point. So confirm Measure H is a special fund in the county, and as far as the allocations go, all of those allocations have been made for fiscal year 17-18 and are tentative for 18-19 and 1920, and stakeholder input is vital to everything we've done. In order to allocate the $355 million that Measure H will bring to the county, we had a 50-member community and county partnership and planning where we involved stakeholders, community members, cities, faith leaders, service providers, and we arrived at consensus on how to spend the $355 million, and we are completely transparent and everything, so it's all on our website, including implementation plans and how all of that funding is breaking down. So feel free to visit and talk to me anytime.
That's great. Thanks for the update.
Hello. My name is Claudia. I work for the American Heart Association, and I have just a general question. You know how the state has like the independent analyst that looks at the budget, what that's going to cost, how the state is prioritizing investments. Do we have that at the county level here in LA County?
Not set out with its own sort of powers and authorities and under state law. You have that function in some respects sits within the Chief Executive Office, but it's not a sort of, in the state's case, it's actually a separate legislatively empowered authority that's independent and does work at the request of the legislature, and in many respects then serves as a check against the governor and the Department of Finance as they put out their budget information. So it kind of goes back to something I was saying earlier, which is, whereas at the state level we have kind of these executive level functions and authorities, and then we have these legislative functions and authorities. You have those at the county level, that's all kind of wrapped up inside of one office.
Not sure what happened there. Just a quick addition too, within LA County, our Auditor Controller's Office has actually been taking on some of this function too. But as Chris said, it often is as like a tool of the board. So like the board gets concerned about what's going on in probation, for example. You see a lot of audits coming out of the AC's office about tracking all of their spending and figuring out if they're doing the right thing or not. So it's valuable, but it's definitely not independent in the way the LAO is up in Sacramento.
And hi, I'm Anna Colby with the California Food Policy Advocates. So you mentioned that, sometimes when you're looking at making county change, it's about going to the state, the state level. I'm wondering if there are any levers within the county budgeting system to make state level change, either, change with the state budget or with state policy.
Definitely. I mean, and particularly in LA County, by almost any measure, it's the biggest animal in the total state roll-up of dollars, or in terms of the total number of people served in a particular program. So if there's, something that your agencies that are delivering the services say about how things are working and could work better at the state level, LA certainly has wields more influence in that regard. So I think and I think it often does. We have a member of our board of directors who has the County Welfare Directors Association, and I know that through their association, the human service agencies are routinely affecting how the implementation of state services happens, and in some respects, how the state allocation of funds for those services is happening to the extent that there's some control. So it can definitely happen in both directions.
Hi, Alex Olson from the Drug Policy Alliance. So I had a question about the net county cost and how much that's really changed over time. So how much is it really elastic, especially when the majority of it's being spent on the public protection? So if you're interested in changing that at all, how much Is that a reality, or has that been over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the overall allocations don't tend to bounce around that much because, I mean, one of the real factors within budgets is, once funding gets locked in, that's positions, that's people. Each department definitely wants to hang on to the funding that they've got. And so it's pretty hard to make big shifts year over year. And then the other thing I'd say about net county costs, the county would probably say actually about half of that is locked in through various, legal restrictions they've got. So it's not about, strings tied to the particular dollar, but they've got maintenance of effort requirements, they've got an obligation to provide, indigent criminal defense. So, really about like $3.5 billion of that 7.7 is already spoken for. So it's a comparatively small amount, but you can actually make substantial shifts, kind of at the margins, which do make a big difference for, particular functions. And the thing I'd say too is that there's often a little more flexibility to get creative within departments. So some of the stuff, you're probably familiar with around, the Office of Diversion and Reentry and some of the changing ways of thinking about what, reentry and models for system impacted folks could look like, trying to shift, saying, okay, you've got the same allocation, but let's do more with a contract basis. Let's get some of these dollars actually out onto the ground and not just with more probation officers and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's probably not the case that we can go, let's take that 42% going to public protection, let's get that down to 30%. But, probably getting it down a couple percentage points and moving it upstream and then thinking about, are those dollars within the, public protection and justice system being spent in the right way? I think there's definitely places where, we've seen change happen. It's slow, you got to push for it. It's always the way, but, advocacy can work there, yeah.
Ipiani Locker, California Partnership. And this question is more for the advancement project, but is there any examples throughout the state of, because when we look at the county budgets, we see so much go into, safety and justice, law and protection. A lot of the law enforcement agencies seem to consume a lot of the budget. And I was wondering, is there any examples of, in any particular counties where law enforcement is actually doing a good job with the implementation of Prop 47? Yeah, you got to ask, because we need to kind of show some positive models to help some other counties, because I'm from, San Bernardino and Riverside County, and they definitely were not in favor of Prop 47 and a lot of the restorative justice approaches. So if we could find a model that's actually showing that it is making positive outcomes that trying to influence the decision makers within our counties.
Yeah, and I wish I had much better news on this front. I mean, I will say around Prop 47, I mean, the conversations I've had is that LA is seen as somewhat of a leader. We definitely have a long way to go, but we have tried to get our hands around these questions of where were the savings and how did they get reallocated, and hopefully that is feeding into a conversation about how to effectively use at least the state dollars that we're getting through the grants. And I think that grant program is set up in a way that I think is good. I mean, it is pretty community focused. It is trying to get money out the door to community organizations. Again, could be better. There could be a better realization of how much money the jails save from letting all those folks out. But at least it's something. I will say around realignment, I think there are some counties with some pretty positive models, again, about partnering with community. I think a lot more of them actually up in the Bay Area. So I think Alameda's been lifted up, and a couple others up there. So, again, there's some bright spots. And, sometimes it's about getting a set of supervisors who really want to say, okay, let's figure this out. Let's make this a priority, as with the Office of Diversion here. Sometimes it is a little more working the inside game and trying to, sit at some of these, councils around how the realignment dollars go out and working that angle. But I think shifting that definition of what counts as public protection, saying, okay, we want everybody to safe, but does that mean more and more jails, or does it actually mean upstream prevention? I mean, there's a lot of literature there. I think folks are starting to come around. I think it's just that advocacy gap where we got to make sure the decision makers understand the urgency of that. But it seems like it's starting to happen in some places.
We're going to take one more question, if there is one more question, and then we'll take a break and set up for our next panel. We have one more? We have one more.
Just more so about the visions for each of the organization and the work that you guys are doing, knowing your experience and tilling in these fields for a long time. What are your hopes for the near future or even long-term vision as well?
Well, I think we just spent some time talking about the Proposition 47 side of that, or in the context of realignment. I think, I think we'd all like to see the allocation of scarce resources, whether that's at the state government level or the county level, shift to being in areas that it's reducing inequality, increasing equity, and having improved outcomes for folks. And so the opportunities there, you know, without going to the sort of tax side of things, which we should be going to as well, it's a separate conversation, but in the sort of sense of what your supervisors can control year in, year out, we certainly would like to see a shift from some of those, you know, incarceration models toward other sorts of investments we can make in individuals that are actually improving their lives and improving their communities. So I think that's one priority. And then the other is we eventually have to take on the tax side of things, both from a fairness perspective and have the available revenues that we need, whether that's Proposition 13 reform or other state level reforms, those kinds of things need to happen as well.
Great. I'd like to associate myself with everything Chris just said, which was great. It's definitely about adequacy and especially revenues. It's definitely about equity and allocation. The one thing I'd just add too is that I think it's really also about power. And especially at the local level, I mean, Chris has helped lead a really great like ecosystem of like state-based advocates who I think get their voices heard, are engaged, you know, and folks understand that what they do is going to get looked at by a really engaged set of folks who know their stuff. At the county level and at the local level, that isn't nearly as much the case. And so I think that a lot of our vision is, okay, how can we play a role in just, you know, building some capacity, building some power so that, you know, whether it's LA County, LA City, you know, the school district, you know, Riverside County, you know, all of these folks who are stewards of, you know, public dollars, like the dollars that we generate, our tax dollars and everything else they've got to spend comes from us. You know, how can we make it so that they understand that they're accountable, that, you know, whether they are delivering on equity, whether they're living up to their promises is going to play a role on whether they get reelected, whether the media says they're doing a good job, and people understanding that budgets are a key part of that. You know, I think that's where we ultimately would like to go, because I think that'll make a pretty big difference.
And that's actually a great segue to the next panel, because we're going to have several people talk with you about their own experiences in that power building around budget work. And so thank you all for your questions and for your indulging Mike and I's long-winded budget presentation.
Yeah, I actually, hold on.
All right, welcome back to part 2. Just a quick notice here. We're going to make sure that there's an email sent out to everybody who's registered and signed in with the slides, the recording, and event evaluation, and that'll go out tomorrow. There you go. Perfect. All right, so welcome back to part 2 here. I like a lot of what we heard in the first part. I'm really excited to hear what we're going to hear in the second part as well. So we've assembled a panel of experts to walk us who are battle tested. I mean, folks up here have years of experience in LA's organizing and social justice community, but really of trying to move public dollars to make sure that the practices of our local government reflect our priorities. So they'll take some of the lessons they've learned and determine what's applicable to your, you can take the lessons that they've learned and determine what's applicable to your situation. They'll show best practices and tips for engaging in advocacy, in the advocacy portion of public sector budget. So please ask questions. And for me, just, you know, as a kind of note for folks, you know, as a program officer, I'm always interested in kind of listening and understanding what's involved so I can be better prepared to support this portion of the type of work that you guys do. So campaigns on the implementation side, and that's an important thing for me to try to keep in mind on the philanthropy side of things. I'm also really interested in kind of addressing that issue of generating revenue. So I'm interested to hear a couple of points that come out of this conversation. I'm really pleased to turn over this section to Tammy Bang Liu, seasoned organizer here in LA County with 20 years of experience, who's led campaigns to hold public transportation accountable to its riders, developed the leadership of those riders to win major concessions through organizing, advocacy, and even lawsuits. And this is one of the nation's largest public transportation systems in the country. And so let me turn it over to Tammy here. I think she knows a lot about this topic. And now I know she's raising her 1-year-old daughter who just celebrated a birthday earlier this week. So let's give it up for Tammy. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Joseph. You know,
before I introduce the panelists and we start, I want to get a sense of the room. How many of you guys actually, within your organizations, do community organizing, power building, and budget advocacy? It's like it's part of your shop. Okay. And how many of you guys are thinking about incorporating this budget advocacy work into the work that you guys are doing? Okay. And then how many of you guys are just here for information and you're not sure when you're going to start to implement any of the things that you've actually learned today? Okay. All right. All right. So that's good. That's good for our panelists to know. Joseph was right. On this panel, you've got over 65 years of experience in direct organizing, in leadership development, in managing campaigns, and holding public officials accountable, and trying to figure out how to build power on the outside to leverage the wins on the inside. Right? I love working with Chris and Mike, and I wish I could nerd out with the folks in AP. They walk you through some of the theory and the thinking about it, right? And we know praxis is important. You need to think about the practice side of it and the reflection side of it. So Joseph said, we're asking this panel to really think about how do they bring up the lessons learned? What are the good and the bad? What's the best practices, and what are some real tips? So we're hoping in the next hour and a half, we're going to talk strategy with you, right? And then we're going to make some time for Q&A so you guys can actually get more pointed in the questions. Is that cool? So I'm going to throw it out to them with specific questions, and then we'll go to the audience. If I think anything's missing, I'm going to ask a set of questions, and we'll go back to the audience. Is that cool? Are you guys ready? All right. So this is Veronica Cabradas. She's California College. I know, it's a lot of names, girl. California College, and she's also a board member of the Budget Center. And I want her to really kick it off thinking about, from an advocacy point, what is the role of government? What are the real components of work? And how do you actually think about this work with the long game in mind? So where are ways to shift the balance of power towards community? And not just, you want to know the rules, but how do you push the rules? How do you change the rules? So go ahead, Veronica.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. I'm really excited about today. I want to start off by talking about the role of government, and then talking a little bit about what we can do as advocates and share some lessons learned. So the role of government continues to be called into question, right? There's a national debate taking place on this very issue. On the federal level, we're hearing calls for smaller government with fewer regulations, tax cuts for the rich so that job creators can create more jobs for the rest of us, right? And the theory is that eventually their wealth will trickle down to the rest of us. That's the theory, right? I see a lot of nodding heads, just, saying, no, not going to happen, right? So I think there's some important questions for us to consider. Should government provide important services like healthcare, protect the undocumented, or should government invest in defense, protecting our borders, and slash away government services like healthcare? I would argue that government matters, right, and is a necessary component for all the issues that everyone here in this room works on. Government should be inclusive of everyone and responsive to our needs as a community, and effectively carry out strategies that allows all of us to prosper. Many say that the budgets that we create reflect the values of our society, right? So this morning you heard a lot about the budget for California. And so I want us to think about that. California, where we have, it's a very wealthy state, but at the same time we have growing income inequality. 5.5 million Californians and almost 1.8 million children live in poverty. What does this say about the values that we have in our society? What does it say about the values that we have in the state of California? And what can we do as advocates to curb this growing trend, right? Because this trend just continues to grow. So what are we going to do collectively to change this? How can we as advocates create a responsive government that takes care of the homeless, that provides housing for the poor, and quality education and health care for all? I would say that we have to do several things, right? We have to organize, we have to both organize to support government, and at the same time, we have to be not afraid to push our elected leaders to do the right thing, right? Because we know there's competing interests, and sometimes they get off course. Even the most progressive elected leaders get off course. And it's our responsibility to hold them accountable and put them back on course when necessary. I want to share a little bit about California Calls, because it was some of these issues that actually got us started. So California Calls came together as a statewide alliance of grassroots community-based organizations for two reasons. First of all, we were seeing that there were major cuts happening at the statewide level, and at the local level, community-based organizations, we were constantly on the defensive mode, reacting to the cuts that were happening at the statewide level. And essentially, we were scrambling to get more and more of the crumbs, right, that were coming from the statewide level. And so we realized it wasn't enough for us to be doing work at the local level for additional funding, but that we needed to launch statewide campaigns so that we were at the table at the statewide level. The second reason California Calls came together was that our communities were taken for granted. And a big reason for that was that our folks were not turning out to vote. I mean, just to be frank about it. So not only were their voices not being heard on important policy issues, we had not built as community-based organizations, we had not built the power that was needed to be recognized. In 2009, we set off to build a statewide alliance of grassroots community-based organizations with a multi-year strategy to pass tax and fiscal reform policies at the statewide level. We did this by reorganizing. We brought all of these community-based organizations across the state, and we reorganized around a long-term policy agenda and a strategy to expand the electorate and create a new center of gravity to advance progressive policies in the state. This included developing a statewide apparatus, which included, we started doing integrated civic engagement programs. So what does that mean? We started reaching out and talking to voters in our communities during election cycles and during non-election cycles, so we were building relationships with voters over time. We knew that this was necessary to both transform the electorate here in California, which is predominantly older and white, when we know that the population is predominantly younger and more people of color. And we also did this because we knew that it was important for our communities to know the issues, and it was important for us to engage new and infrequent voters. And this is part of our plan to mobilize and turn out people in the thousands. We also invested in a predictive dialing system so that our partner organizations had access to the latest technology and could do their organizing at a scale that was never done before. Previous to this, many of our groups had done organizing and voter engagement work maybe in the hundreds, able to reach out hundreds of voters. Through this technology, we were able to increase our scale and reach voters in the thousands. I want to share just a few accomplishments from this reorganization that we had. Since 2009, we've had 17 programs, civic engagement programs that we've done in the state, and we've developed a voter base of 710,000 voters across the state. And we've increased the turnout of our base communities, so these are low-income communities of color, they're immigrants and they're women, between 10 to 20% statewide. In 2012, along with the California Federation of Teachers, we introduced the millionaire's tax, which actually merged with the governor's proposal and became Proposition 30. Around that particular measure, we turned out about 500,000 voters in 2012. And I want to pause here and state that California Calls is both a nonprofit organization, but we also have a C4 branch. And so the work that I'm talking about around specific propositions was done through our C4 work, just to be clear about that. So in 2012, we turned out about 500,000 voters, which represented 6% of the yes vote. And again, folks, these are new and infrequent voters in communities of color across the state. In 2014, 2 years later, with the help of PICO, we passed Proposition 47, which reduced charges for low-level crimes like drug possession from felonies to misdemeanors. This past November, along with our partners, we have many statewide partners like PICO, CHIRLA, Mobilize the Immigrant Vote, and ACE, and a number of other organizations. We launched the Million Voters Project. And the goal is to be able to turn out 1 million voters by 2018. Through this work, we've been able to qualify a number of big initiatives across the state. In partnership with NextGen, we registered about 83,000 new voters in 3 months leading up to November. So part of the work is not only turning out voters to vote, but it's also ensuring that we're registering voters so that they're engaged in the civic engagement process. So just to talk about a few lessons learned. One of the big lessons learned is that you can't do it alone, right? So if we're going to push forward progressive policy reforms in this state, we have to work in partnership with either coalitions or with statewide alliances. And so it's important to work with groups that may not be like our organizations. It's important to work with religious organizations, other community-based networks, housing organizations, labor, because we need to build a movement of people working on progressive change. The other lesson learned is the need for big, bold policy solutions. We've learned time and time again that while it's important to work on the defensive fights, and many of us, thanks to Trump, have been working on defensive fights the whole year, right? We've been working on trying to stop the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. We've been working on defensive fights around DACA. We've been working on a number of defensive fights throughout the year. While those fights are important in protecting our communities, we also need to be able to go on the offense. And there's a need for us to be putting forward progressive policy solutions. With that in mind, California Calls, along with a number of partners through the Make It Fair Coalition, in 2015, we started organizing around Prop 13 reform. Now, many people in California see Prop 13 reform as a third rail. But Prop 13 reform is necessary if we want to bring stability back to California. This is about closing loopholes that exist in the commercial property tax system that allow millionaires and billionaires to not pay their fair share in the state of California. This is currently costing, based on our new analysis, up to $11 billion in revenue that could be going to our schools, our community colleges, and to local services that are not going into our communities. And so it's important to not be afraid to push forward bold ideas. The other piece I want to emphasize is to start with the power analysis and to do power building, right? In the example that I gave earlier, we had to do a power analysis to think about how can we as a local organization build statewide power. And so part of it was looking at who were the key players, who were the decision makers, and who were the targets. And so I want to emphasize is for those of you who have not done power analysis, that the importance of doing that. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up. One final important point is that we need to resist the tendency to work in silos. Many of us work on our particular issue, right? So if we're housing groups, we're working on housing. If we're immigration groups, we're working on immigration, right? So it's important for us to step out of silo-based organizing and work together in alliances to build a stronger movement for all of us.
So next up, we have Solomon Rivera. He is the Chief of Staff for Los Angeles Councilmember Marquise Harris-Dawson, CD 8. But he comes actually having been on the ground for many, many years. Veronica talked a lot about the need to have a power analysis. And Mike, when he started his presentation, really laid out who some of the folks were, right? How do you actually start to build these relationships internal? Who do you look for? What are the best inroads? Chris and Mike talked about the need to make this all year round. Where are the possible places where we can mold and shape our priorities given that? And really from an insider point of view, just in terms of best lessons and tips, what are the ways to do that so that you can get, so we can all get some priorities on the docket? And from your experience, like what does that look like in terms of the cycle?
Is that what we talked about in the prep call?
Yeah. It sure was what we talked about in the prep call.
I got
you. Know?
I got it.
Like, how do you build relationships? What does that look like? Who do you point out? Who do you know? Like, who actually are some of the decision makers besides the big ones? But how do you get to the board of directors?
So I'm going to try and cover that with 3 examples, but I got to start with really applauding the work of California Calls and Veronica. The things she's talking about are exactly what I do now on the inside. We just did a power analysis for us, being on the inside to do a city jobs campaign, it's going to be inside outside, of course. We're not going to organize from City Hall, but we took that approach. You know, who's got the power? Who are the allied opposition and allies? So there's also the main thing that you started with around fiscal policy, why California Call started. We're never going to solve our problems in fixing our tattered safety net till we fix Prop 13. So like, I'm there behind you 100% on that work, and you guys got to win for us, for all of us in this room. There's three takeaways I want to hit, and one of them you referenced is about relationships. So unlike the Democratic Party, who I've worked for, and most campaigns, they come knocking on doors and visiting churches 2-3 months before the election. You talked about doing that in between and building those relationships. My first takeaway from the first example is relationships are golden. So after being working in some of the social services and also building power at community-based organizations for 16 years, I found myself on the inside. My old friend became Speaker of the California State Assembly and asked me to go work for her. I went from, I'd run a nonprofit that was doing racial justice and trying to close the achievement gap in schools, 5 school districts, and knocking on doors at the state capitol. I went from all those years and doing that work to being on the inside, and it was 2008 when the economy crashed. So all of a sudden, these really great advocates and friends of mine were coming to me, pounding on my door, and it was really harsh. That's getting thrown in the deep end, and it's a pool full of lava. So, but I realized then from the work I had done that I hadn't built nearly enough relationships when I was on the outside. That I knew like a key person here or there, and I would go to them for this analysis, this research, set up this meeting, get this amendment or whatever. When I got to, actually when I worked for Sacramento, we were kind of doing some of that power building. I went there to do some political work, and we were trying to win a 2/3 majority, which is not work you do inside the Capitol. It was like external. So I was working on state assembly races up and down the state, but the day job was sitting in an office, hearing my old advocates friends come and say, "Don't cut this program. This means lives. People are going to suffer." The sad reality was, that recession devastated the state budget. Before the recession, that state budget was running with the main general fund and special funds, because there's these other funds, other ways to capture it. It was about $130 billion. Huge economy, the state. At the depth of the recession, we had to cut that down to $80 billion. As I say, just imagine what that did to all the programs. If you all were around then, I see some young faces here. And what I learned, because I worked mostly in the field, but when I was up in the Capitol, there's 3 or 4 key people you need to get to, and there's a million staff like you need to know who's on the various budget committees, because there's budgets in sub 1, sub 2, sub 3, sub 4, sub 5. But if you wanted to move something, and say the biggest thing is, if you want, you're changing the game now, but all these years past, if you wanted to do a state initiative around funding, there's 2 key players, 2 unions that had to agree, or it just wasn't going to happen. It didn't matter if you had the governor in your corner in the assembly. It was like they had the army, they had 20, 30 million they'll throw in any campaign, so they were the gatekeepers. But in the building, there's a guy named Rick Simpson, and he comes out of education. And if you don't know Rick or somebody close to Rick, you're not going to do any meaningful work. It is really tough to hear that, but that's the reality, and that's the power of lobbyists, for lack of a better word, whether it's in Sacramento, DC, here at City Council. I get requests and take meetings with lobbyists every day that unfortunately aren't the people in this room. I need more of you knocking on my door. I'll set you up meetings with the appropriate staff. I'll take meetings. I do it all the time. I wish the ratio was like 90 you to 1 lobbyist, but right now it's about the opposite. So you need to figure out who those staff are, and it's a pretty liberal council. I think it could be a progressive council, but it's a pretty liberal council. They care about your issues. They care about social services. They care about the safety net. The city has certain parameters. The same applies to the county, though. The county's got great people I've started to learn. We've worked with them on homelessness. So all that's to say is another just mini lesson. So the state budget obviously fluctuates wildly. Does anyone know what the last budget pass was? From that low of $80 billion, it's $180. It's over 100% increase. That's the one that was passed last year. So the people that had the least cuts, if you're really smart, you do your own initiative. Education is protected. They locked in 40% of the state budget through Prop 98 years ago. Really smart move on their behalf. If you have that kind of power, do it. If you don't, build the relationships. So there's opportunities and a dire need when the budget is shrinking. You got to protect your dollars. You got to save those programs. And the biggest thing we did while we were there with a progressive and one leadership role, of course, you had to sit down with Arnold Schwarzenegger and negotiate the stuff, which wasn't fun. But to not make those cuts permanent, to like, you know, take this program away or reduce it for a year or two and then revisit it as the funding got better. So there's opportunities and dire need when the budget's shrinking, but obviously as it's grown, has anybody's programs grown 100+% in the last few years? I didn't think so, but the budget's grown. The state funding's there for health care. They're spending too much on prisons still, of course. So anyways, build relationships, whether it's federal, state, local, use those relationships, build more. I need more lobbyists like you doing that work. So the second, how am I on time? The second example is local. When we, I've just been at City Hall for 2 years. When my friend, the councilman, got elected, he had experienced a lot of issues, but not on homelessness, but he got made chair of the homelessness committee, go figure. And the lesson here is know the political environment and take advantage of it. So on an issue we knew nothing of, we had a steep learning curve. We were given a committee assignment, but all the signs were there. Unfortunately, on the streets every day you saw more and more encampments. And the communities outside of South and East and Central LA and Skid Row, where it was visible for generations, now it was visible all over the city on the west side and the valley, large encampments. So all of a sudden, in a very short time period, in a couple of years, it became really a top political issue. Whereas, you know, things like jobs and education rank really high. Also, homelessness was ranking as a top issue. And, you know, there's that moment where politicians are ready to act. There's a need to do something. So we were actually fortunate that people came together and played nice. Us and the county worked for months behind the scenes and literally agreed to pass our own comprehensive plans on the same day. So that was a good gesture of government working together. And what's key, it wasn't just a bunch of staff at City Hall and the County Hall of Administration. There was dozens of advocates convened for all these kind of, you know, thinking sessions to develop those plans. So I don't know if anybody in this room works in homelessness services. Anyone? Yay! What organization? That's great. So from your organization, United Way, there's great leadership. Antonio and Ann helped pull together the funding and helped shape what became the plans passed at county and city. We have 64 action items in our plan. It's a comprehensive plan the city had for the first time to address homelessness. One of those items, one of the 64 items was we need 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing. That's not shelter housing. That's long-term housing, and then you have the services for somebody who's chronically homeless, you know, mental health conditions, you know, a PSTD veteran, et cetera. So that's not cheap. Those come at about $400,000 a pop. So one piece, the biggest piece, was that housing. So it's great to pass a plan, but you got to fund it. You got to implement it. So we end up polling on various scenarios, various funding mechanisms, settle on a parcel tax. A lot of people inside City Hall at the county were, because there was other things on the ballot, so this is November 16 ballot, there was a parks bond, there was Measure M, there was a bunch of asks for the public to vote for money. So people said, hold off on that, it can wait a few months. We said, hell no. Knowing the political environment, the time to strike was then. So we pushed it through against other people. What we did is negotiate. The advocates were great. They pushed for, we need the entire $2 billion. Others wanted to make it $500 million. We ended up with a compromise of $1.2 billion. The voters approved overwhelmingly. In less than a year, we've already put in a pipeline, $100 million of that towards permanent supportive housing. So we're on track to spend that $1.2 billion over 10 years. That's not going to end homelessness, but it's going to make a significant impact on the homelessness you see out there. So again, knowing the political moment, the environment, 5 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. 3 years ago, might not have been possible. last year, all of a sudden it was possible. We didn't know what we were doing. We knew elections, so that's why we pushed for that bond. We knew, how to read the political environment. So we kind of got lucky. It's a tragedy what's happening out there on the street, but we were able to propose a solution. So that's number 2. I'm going to make 3 really brief. It's just about the process that happens everywhere. At the city, does anybody engage in the budget process at the city? You know when the budget hearings are? Yeah. Okay. You know when the budget hearings are? Exactly. So when do you start getting ready for that May process? You're late. So it really, as soon as the budget is passed, it starts right away. People start meeting right away. We get a letter like this from the mayor. This was in August. This is a little while back. But by then, several meetings have happened. Then pretty soon, I'm going to start getting binders from 20 or 30 departments at the city with their own proposed budgets. So all this stuff is happening now. And the earlier you get in, the better. Like literally, if you have something that really needs funding, don't wait. Like start as soon as the budget's passed. Start your work, build those relationships, be very specific. I think I brought an example. So you can barely see this, but this is a nicely formatted budget ask when we sit down with the mayor's team. And it has a couple areas, violence, homelessness, and then we list what we want to address that. And it's capital projects and back to basics. And it's a none too subtle approach. We know it's his priorities, back to basics. And then the other priorities are these are things that have been in the news and will be in the news. And if you don't want to look bad, you're going to fund these. So, and when we started meeting with the mayor's staff our first year, like we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have a lot of city insiders on our staff. But said like, damn, you guys like got a good presentation. And we asked for a certain amount. I got about half of that, not bad negotiation. And people said we did really well. So we just keep doing that. So the point is we probably started late, but now we're on this constantly. We're constantly talking to people about what the needs are in our district. We need this pool rebuilt. We need this park redone. We need funding for our model of community prevention in a certain park. So, that's our job in looking out for a community that is, woefully neglected and underserved. So, for us, it's easy to do it all day, every day. But for you and your programs, if you need more funding, you at least need to think about it, at least every season. What are we doing on budget? How can I do some early work? So I think I need to wrap up. I'm over time now. Thanks.
Thanks, Solomon. Next up, we have Lola Smallwood Cuevas, who is the co-founder of the LA Black Worker Center and is also on the national network of building Black Worker Centers all across the country. There's 8 of them. The last one was in Raleigh, North Carolina, right? So not only are we looking at regional, one of the, further research about strategy tactics that build. And I want Lola to really speak upon what does it mean to actually, right? How do we actually put the most impacted efforts there and follow that? What's the political, what's the engagement process? On the one hand, and then also there was a lot of conversation. So when you're actually thinking, how do you actually include budget and ask to just thinking about how you lay out your demands, how you think about the process, how do you think about political aspects?
That's your organizer voice. Yeah. No, thanks so much, Tammy, and really appreciating my co-panelists here. It's been really informative. And so proud of the work that's happening both at California Calls and the initiative around really lifting up Black civic engagement and building on the dynamic voting experience and power of that community and certainly the 8th District. And I'm happy to say that the Black Worker Center was brought in as an expert for the power analysis on Black employment and what are some of the challenges that our constituencies face in terms of accessing jobs and where are there opportunities for us to work together to think about resources to help those workers who are the most vulnerable in our communities. And I want to just speak to the kind of a little bit of what Solomon said and what you said, Tammy, which really struck me in terms of like the power building piece and the lobbyist piece, and that is there are no experts on the issues that our government is funding, our government is putting our tax dollars behind to try to solve, be it housing, be it unemployment, be it health care, that workers and residents and our constituencies don't know inside and out. There are no greater experts than the people who are living those experiences, and we need to turn our members into lobbyists who can then go in and educate in terms of truth of what is happening and what are the real remedies. The Black Workers Center, LA Black Workers Center, was incubated at the UCLA Labor Center, and it's amazing the amount of research that is happening there from the 3,000-foot level. But they can't explain one thing about what does it mean to be a Black unemployed worker in the county of Los Angeles, and what are the things that would directly make a material difference in those workers' lives. And I think a big part of power building when we look at the budget process and why it is important that those solutions lie in our neighborhoods and in our communities. So, you know, our perspective in this conversation about how do we build campaigns and think about the power of our constituents to really shape budget decisions that will make a difference in their lives. And I want to start by saying that, you know, the Black Workers Center is, you know, a grassroots action center on Crenshaw Boulevard, LA's Black downtown. If you didn't know that and haven't visited, you really should do that. And it's really the place where we're dealing with the trauma of the Black jobs crisis. When Black workers are the last hired, when they are the first fired, when they stand up for themselves on their jobs and their employers retaliate against them, when their wages are stolen from them, when they've worked hours and have not been able to support their families, and recognizing that in this great city that there are 50% of Black working age adults who don't have jobs or who are working poor on the daily. And so from that point of view, we see ourselves as experts in terms of what are some of the ways in which we need to address the problem. And I think from our members' standpoint, it's really, you know, spending a good amount of time, as Solomon said, building relationships to sort of take the experiences that Black workers are having, but also laying it over and understanding, like, what are the budget opportunities, and understanding what are places where public dollars can be infused to make a difference. And I wanted to share a little bit about some of the lessons learned out of one particular, you know, campaign, and that is the work of the LA Black Workers Center on the steering committee of the Raise the Wage campaign. Are folks familiar with the Raise Wage campaign? Okay, it's the largest minimum wage policy passed in the nation that not only created a metric by which we would raise the wage over the next 5 years to $15 an hour, but we would also create a whole enforcement infrastructure that would ensure that workers actually receive those wages. And so I think out of that experience, what was really, for the purposes of this discussion, what I think is really important is that we went into that campaign, the Black Workers Center, as a member of the LA County Coalition Against Wage Theft. We went into the campaign with the end in mind. We wanted an enforcement office to deal with wage theft in the city of Los Angeles, which at the time was the wage theft capital of the nation, right? The statistic was $26 million a week stolen from workers by employers. And even when workers were able to find attorneys and go through the arduous process of going to the state to file complaints, 90% of them did not receive a dime. Companies would fold, and open under another name before they would give the worker a dime. So that was the environment in which we entered into the whole conversation about what does it mean to raise the wage in LA County. And for our members, it was about enforcement because workers were already not getting the minimum wage. So yes, we wanted $15, but we knew the purpose was for them to get that. And in order for there to be real enforcement, we knew there needed to be real city dollars put behind investigators, put behind legal services through the city attorney's office, put behind communication and education about the law and what the law meant. We knew it also meant dollars invested in partnering with community organizations that had relationships with workers who could actually not, wait until, City Hall, closes at 5 and the workers were just SOL, but it could actually like help workers when they needed help and meet them where they were to ensure that they knew what their rights were and their rights were protected. So that was the framework for us entering into the campaign. And so I think one of the key things for us to remember is that, policy is only as good as the paper that it's written on. There are so many policies about diversity in the workplace and equity, but still we have a situation where, Black workers are severely underrepresented, right, in their workplaces. So the issue is how are we going to make sure that laws are not just passed, but that they are that they're implemented. And so, we set out the Coalition to End Wage Theft. We partnered obviously with SEIU in the Fight for the 15 campaign and the LA County Federation of Labor. We created a very dynamic and broad and wide coalition of over 200 organizations in the Raise the Wage campaign. And our focus as part of the steering committee and as part of the study group from the worker centers that made up the Coalition to End Wage Theft was to look at, well, where were the models of this enforcement around enforcing the minimum wage? What did they look like? How successful were they? What was the staffing levels? What were the budgets that they needed to be able to successfully represent workers? And how were they growing, right? Because this is like we wanted to make sure that we had an apparatus in place that had the scale to address 800,000 workers in the city. And so really going into the campaign, thinking about on the outset before we even had, I think, one official campaign hearing at City Hall, we did a lot of research talking to those different cities, San Francisco, New York, and we also did a lot of conversations with some really good systems folks inside of the city, right? I think it's important for us to realize that if there's a department, and in this case it's the Bureau of Contracts Administration at the city of Los Angeles, they were getting like 1% of what the police law enforcement budget was, and their job was to enforce the living wage and prevailing wage, and then they were going to take on this whole issue of the minimum wage. So we knew that they were strapped and needed more resources, and so how do we build a relationship with them to say that we are pushing for the wage, we are demanding that there is real enforcement, and how can we work together to ensure you have the tools that you need to ensure that this ordinance is successful. And so between those conversations with the inside folks in the system and the analysis of budgets from those models across the country, we had a really viable, concrete budget outline in terms of down to the number of staff that we needed, down to the number of scale and tier per year, down to what the city would need to operate that kind of an enforcement department at that level. And that was all based on the work we did coming into the campaign. But again, even if you have the cooperation and you have the data, it takes the power, right? It takes hundreds of workers turning out to every hearing, every budget hearing, every budget committee hearing, and really making the demand and the case that the city live up to its responsibility to ensure that what the community was calling for in order to make this law effective and real, that it was actually realized. And I know I have to close, but I will say one last thing, and this is to the point that Solomon mentioned, that there are usual and unusual suspects in this process, right? And who knew that, like, the city public unions who represented city workers, right, who are very concerned about the budget and any changes in the budget and what it means for their members, but they were extremely helpful in us calculating down to the penny what an investigator one actually makes and what that actually looks like in real money and what the projection would be over the next year. Again, information that helped the community have a solid and viable plan. And in the end, we won the ordinance, of course. We won the budget the first year for implementation. I think we received $500,000 before we hired one staff. There was money to seed it, and now it's up to $2.6 million for minimum wage enforcement, and we're really excited about that.
Thank you, Lola. All right. So you guys had a chance to hear about the budget. You've got a chance to hear some of their lessons and their tips. Any questions from the floor for any of our panelists? I'll go this one. Did I have it over there? Great.
Definitely. I just want to say thank you to each one of you for the work that you guys do within our community and world at large. I know for all of us, we want to turn our community members into that advocate, but I just want to know some of your approaches when we dealing with communities that have plagued with violence, where they've been beat up, esteem issues. A lot of them think their vote doesn't count. Some of them don't even think their own lives count. How is it that we get past those barriers for them to acclimate and not only just be an advocate when it comes to community issues, but also be a champion in their life and in humanity at large?
So, I mean, when I talked about the trauma, I would say the lion's share of our work is building Black workers back up. The structure, the system, and particularly over the last 30, 40 years, is conservative, mainstream drumbeat that this is bootstrapped, poverty is your fault, these conditions are your fault. And our communities have internalized those experiences. And so we do have to invest time in building the relationship, creating opportunities for our community to step back and to see the structures and the systems that are at play in their lives, to look back at the history, right? I mean, Black people couldn't live west of Broadway just about, 40 years ago, right? The segregation and what that means and what it has meant to their families for generations, and the institutions that have been built up around those sorts of white supremacist experiences. And I think the more we are educating our constituents, the more we are showing the systems that are at work, but also recognizing that those systems are made by people, and to reinforce the values of other people. And that's why we have to show that as we come together, create opportunities for collective conversation, to show that if we come together and move collectively, we can move our values. Our values can be a way of changing the paradigm in the conversation and shaping the system. So, leadership development, education, calling folks like these folks in to help, explain, what is happening in the economy, what's happening in our government, and what power we have to make that difference.
Yeah, just to add a few things to that, California calls part of the power that we have as a statewide alliance is that we work with some fantastic organizations at the local level. So in Los Angeles, some of our the groups that we work with in South LA are like Community Coalition, Scope. On the east side, it's Inner City Struggle, and then we also work with ACE, which works in parts of the east side and other parts of Los Angeles. It really is the one-on-one work that they do with members that makes a difference. And so these are one-on-one meetings that they're doing with members. They're doing house visits with members to talk about the issue. It also is about doing the leadership development that's necessary, so doing the political education on important issues so that people understand the systems of oppression, that the systems that create oppression, right? So that people understand the policy issues at play. One of the big things that we do statewide for all the communities that we've worked in is we provide a voter guide, right? And it's really important that in the voter guide we're using our language, right? So we're talking about the issues in a way that people can understand them. We also translate the voter guide into different languages so that it's accessible to people who may not be English native speakers. And so that's another way of ensuring that our folks are educated about what's going to be on the ballot. They understand the issues, right? And then one other key piece of work that we do, we've never been about parachuting people in, right? I think a lot of other groups, they parachute organizers in to a particular community. And it's really obvious when you're from that community that that other person is not from your community, right? It's really obvious. And so it's really important that when we're doing organizing in specific communities, that we're building the leadership capacity of our members, right? And so that it's our members that are talking to other people in their communities, because they're the ones that best understand what the key issues are in that community. They best understand how to overcome, right, some of the challenges, and they can talk about some of the potential wins and the vision, right, for making a difference.
I'm just going to echo what they said and just, reassure them that they can't do it alone. They need to find that collective, that organization that is building power and help build that power, and then they can make a change.
Another question.
Hi, Patrick McFarland with Crystal Stairs. I wanted to talk specifically in terms of budget advocacy. It seems like the policy areas that might best, form a coalition to sort of make a change in the budget end up fighting over the exact resources that they might think could help their specific policy area. And I'm wondering if you all have any insight or tools for forming those coalitions, and then if you're unable to, what would kind of be the next steps?
Before you guys jump in, because there's a lot of questions, I'm going to have over here ask a question here, and then we'll move you guys to speak in. Oh, are you holding it? Oh, I'm so sorry.
I kind of want to speak to the question that he said, because I do have a local example in Orange County. I feel like when it comes to budget advocacy, and Orange County is a much less of a monster than LA, so take that into consideration. But I feel like it really takes, at least for my organization, we're 30 years old and we have like a history of base building and leadership development, but the political analysis and the analysis of the landscape when it comes to homelessness specifically for us, it just wasn't there. So luckily for us, we've been able to partner with the ACLU, who's like brought in their policy analyst and researcher around homelessness, who's worked closely with us and brought on that credibility and authority to the work that we're doing. And then, oddly enough, and I want to highlight this because I saw that reflected in all your conversations, specifically Ms. Smallwood, who mentioned the SEIU. We brought on AFSCME, the eligibility workers that serve people experiencing homelessness. And I feel like bringing in labor unions, right, because they're in contract negotiations with the county, because they hold the relationships, at least in Orange County, AFSCME, with the CEO of Orange County, the guy who would never give us a meeting, and then all of a sudden AFSCME is a part of us, and now he wants to hang out with us, right? So I think bringing, again, the research and power of the ACLU works in your region or another partner that might do that, and then the labor power, in addition to your grassroots and history organizing, that's worked for us. And I think I wanted to see, like, how do you see ballot initiatives being something that can be done at the county level? And how do you take that approach when you don't see your county responding through just simple advocacy? And specifically for Ms. Veronica, since you mentioned California calls.
One more question here, and then we'll go to...
My name is Rocio Gonzalez. I'm actually from the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project. We're based out of Oxnard, and so I've come a long way. I really want to learn from all of you. And my question is in regards to Solomon for talking about building relationships. And I want to ask if you could demystify that a little bit more. I used to do advocacy on a statewide level, and now I'm on a county and city level, and I find that it's a lot more difficult to get your foot in the door, to get the Board of Supervisors to take us seriously. We have the data, we have stories, we have concrete policy recommendations, but we just don't have the relationship, and I want to know if you have any more practical examples on how to actually build that.
So unity, struggle inside relationships. How do we think about the budget in a way that we're not eating against each other or fighting against each other? Obviously looking at demystifying how to build relationships, right? And the power of labor, and specifically, how do you leverage on a countywide ballot initiative level?
I can jump in. I think when you're doing any type of budget advocacy, whether it's at the statewide level or at the local level, the first step is knowing the legislative process, right? And so Solomon asked earlier, you know, when does the budget get created, and how soon do people start doing advocacy around it? And it's so important to understand what the process is so that you can be able to insert yourself in the appropriate moments during that process. We're very fortunate that the California Budget and Policy Center provides a statewide analysis on the legislative process. There's groups like Advancement Project that work very closely at the county level and provide analysis on county level budgets. I think these are the resources, right, that we need to go to understand what is the process and when is the best opportunity for us, whether it's through the hearing process, for us to insert ourselves as advocates in this process to make a difference. So I would say that's one of the first pieces. The other piece I want to point to is, you know, there were some questions about who to turn to for help, like how to form coalitions. And in many, on the statewide level, I can say there's a number of statewide coalitions that are already doing work on a number of legislative issues, right? Whether it be immigration, criminal justice reform, just healthcare issues. And so part of it is doing an analysis of the landscape and looking at who are the players on a particular issue and thinking about and meeting with these organizations to figure out how you can align yourself with them. So there's already statewide coalitions doing legislative work, both at the statewide level and at the county level. ACLU has been mentioned. They do a tremendous amount of legislative work. California Partnership, there's a number of coalitions that you can tap into that are doing work. And I think the important thing is thinking about how to connect with these pre-existing organizations or networks so that we're not inventing the wheel if it's not necessary. Now, I want to speak to, in some of these areas, these shifting areas, right? So areas like the Inland Empire. I grew up in Riverside County. Areas like Orange County. I know it's a very different landscape than Los Angeles. The movement infrastructure is still developing, right? And so I think there's when you're looking at a board of supervisors that's truly not going to work on your issue, I think you need to be creative about what the wins are and how to get to those wins, right? And so being able to do that analysis, and in some cases also, if necessary, working with groups to run your own candidates, right? To ensure that you're getting folks that represent your values and your theory of change, right? Getting these folks elected. And so I think it's both working with organizations that are doing organizing in those areas and trying to build coalitions where there isn't pre-existing movement infrastructure, and then also, if necessary, thinking about how do we reorganize, how do we change what's currently there.
I agree with the partnerships with unions and just recognizing that unions are made up of our people, right? Yeah. People who work in communities. So unions increasingly, some are already there, many need to be invited, some have to be pushed. But I think it's really important for us to recognize the power that unions have, not just in the numbers, but the reason why that person wants to hang out is because they invest so much in campaigns and they have such a powerful political apparatus that they help to create alliances and relationships where it's really difficult for like a Black Worker Center, right, to sit down with a state senator and have a conversation about, you know, what's happening in federal transit projects, for example, right? So I think that relationship is really important for community-based organizations and folks who are working in the CBO world to see that your constituencies are the same constituencies that are in unions, and you're coming to them with those kinds of conversations, right? And how are we strengthening work overall? I think in terms of like the struggle around the budget issue, and there were some of those conversations, around, the minimum wage work and some other budgetary issues that were moving in our progressive networks. And Reverend Lawson, told me something that I'll never forget, that struggle within our movement is good, and that we will have those struggles, and we need to have those struggles, and we shouldn't run from those struggles, and we should actually engage and invite them, because at the end of the day, it will hopefully result with a better outcome that's going to actually help our people versus us going into our silos, digging in, and then, having this like estrangement from organizations and conflict. So, it can be challenging, but there are definitely, we learn from different folks who've been out there in those large coalitions who had to do that, and actually helping us through that process, helping us to have those kinds of courageous conversations as a coalition.
Yeah, so many questions. But thanks for coming all the way from Mokisnash. That's a long schlep in the rain. I think the relationships of, we're talking about the unions. Those are always great. Those can be key. That could be a real mixed bag. Like at the state level, I mentioned, there's two gatekeepers, and it's CTA, the teachers. Their priority is not students. It's their job. Their mission is teachers, wages, and benefits. And, that doesn't translate into funds for the students. All that said, I'm more of a supporter for the teachers unions than the charters, because they're a business, and their priority is making a buck, even though they're providing some good alternatives out there. So each union is kind of fraught with their own, liabilities and pluses. I got to deal with the building trades a lot right now. Oh my God. they're like in the Stone Age still. They're kicking and screaming against diversifying, but we need to figure out our relationship with them to diversify in all these massive infrastructure projects that can change the workforce and address chronic unemployment. So the relationship, there's some old stuff in organizing you've probably seen, like the old Midwest Academy, like, well, who's their pastor? And, figuring out the business person they go to that, it's slick and approaching those people and appealing to them. There might be like, PICO, it's LA Voice out here, the church-based organizing network, they're really good about jumping on things like that, not a campaign. They used to be more white middle class with the liberal policy agenda, but they've diversified more in the Latinos kind of population, I think. So I think there's possibly others out there that can ally with you around common interests, as well as the individual relationships you could try and leverage. And then, of course, then there's just escalating to direct action. It's like, okay, you're not going to be friends with us? We're going to put you on blast. We're going to do the press conference. And then at some point you can make it like a different relationship. We're not just targeting them. You ease off and start to talk to them, and they respect you. Sometimes you just got to do that.
We also want to invite viewers who are on the webcast to ask questions, and you can do that on the question console. So if there's any questions from the webcast, please chime in. Are there other questions out there? And did you actually, Veronica, I think there was a question specifically around how do you move ballot measures on a county-wide level? And is that what are some insights on to doing that? And then are there other questions from the floor while Veronica answers that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the county level, very much the same way you do it on the statewide level, right? So you start off with a particular idea. I think you want to make sure you talk to partners on a particular idea, whether it's raising revenue on a particular issue, work with particular partners. You want to do all the same stuff that you do, right? You do on the statewide level, you're going to do polling on a particular issue. You want to get the key messages. You want to think about funding the campaign, how you're going to raise the money to both qualify the initiative, so doing the signature gathering to qualify the initiative, but then actually working to get it on the ballot. So very similar to what you would do at the statewide level. I don't know if you want to find that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of those measures don't cover our specific issues. Homelessness is really unique, and about that political environment, that political moment, you know, you don't see people, and it's policymakers, you know, they'll pass them through the county or city to put it on the ballot. And they're looking at the things that they can't get done with their county or city budgets. Like, we want to build a lot more transportation infrastructure, and we only have so many billions. So that's the stuff that gets on the ballot. It's a lot of insider game. It'd be great if that would change, though, if people could say, like, you know, we want to get $500 million for real domestic violence programs or something. People should try that out. People should, you know, because maybe there's, look at that county board now. There's a lot of potential there. There's 5 women there. There's a liberal shift, or well, there will be 5 at some point. Just saying. So yeah, I think that equation, like California calls it, doing at the state level, what they did with their original initiative really changed that equation I talked about. It was a different union that played a key role. It wasn't the usual players. They had to concede, like, okay, you're right, the millionaire's tax is the way to go. It's a really great story what they did, and the same could happen with local measures, I think.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to point out, when you're looking at revenue at the county level, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but the Supreme Court recently overturned the ruling around the 2/3 threshold at the local level. So instead of requiring a 2/3 threshold to increase taxes at the local level, and now it's a majority vote. And so that was a significant decision by the Supreme Court, and I think it opens up a lot of opportunities to think about how do we raise revenue at the county level and at the local level based on this. California Supreme Court, correct.
I'm going to add in one thing, just a strategy that hasn't been discussed, is litigation. An old nonprofit I ran, Californians for Justice, we had a great working relationship. This group, public advocates in the Bay Area, and we've worked with attorneys every day, and about once a year we filed lawsuits and made change that way. Joseph's old organization, where's Joseph? Community Coalition, last week they won a suit on the state local control funding formula, where it was supposed to go to the poor schools, you know, high levels of foster kids, poor students, et cetera, English learners. You know, the school district, where they had allies, they had insiders, they weren't doing right by that money. So they sued and got $150 million shifted last week, which is, you know, that's the kind of change that really makes a difference. Good work, Patty.
Others?
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm with SEIU Local 2015. I just wanted to kind of give a shout out because I know unions have come up a lot, and I just wanted to echo some of the things that have been said, that, you know, we represent low-income healthcare workers at my local, and we have a lot of the same interests as other advocacy organizations that we're not necessarily experts in. So we really do look to those partnerships to work on those issues like affordable housing, criminal justice, environmental justice. Those are all issues that touch our members throughout the state, and we represent over 300,000 people. So I just wanted to kind of introduce myself, and we're very happy to work with any local organizations on those issues and kind of talk more about.
Great. Others? No? Okay. Anything to close out? Are you guys good? So I think this whole day has been talking about why the question of accountability, we need to turn it into a verb, right? So that it's actually actionable. You know, Mike was talking about these are stewards of our money. What happened to the concept of economic democracy, where we actually get to shape where the money goes? So I do think, you know, right now, part of the game is thinking about where the money should be redistributed, right? Where is the funding currently going, and where should it be going? To be thinking about how we can leverage strategies to expand and generate new revenue, right? To be thinking outside the box. So I think our takeaway today is it is about implementation. And I think I'm really glad that CCF is having this, because that's also not what's funded. The day-to-day work, they want the win, right, at the end of the day. So really fighting for support to have that consistency You know, these board meetings and following the money are political exposures. So don't think that they're going over the head for our members. You get to actually expose people to how the system works, and they understand their own role in it. There's nothing greater than actual political exposures. So you're not sitting just in a flat political education. You're right there. They get to experience it. They get to know who's shaping that, who's making those decisions. They get to follow that money. There's power building in that. Right? And so I think that that's important. So we have to really reiterate, you have to get the people who are most impacted part of this conversation, not just to show up, but to grapple with where the money is going and where it should be going, right? And so I think other lessons that people are saying is look at the long game. Think about this as integrated into your work. Build the coalitions necessary. Look for those relationships. And I think a lot of the folks in the room need to get to know each other, right? Because you guys are going to be up against some similar organizations and similar faces, and really building those relationships and thinking about not just the strategic allies, which you need to find, but the tactical allies. The folks who may not share your long-term vision, but may support you in a short-term game. And you need to think through who are those tactical allies you could also build in that. So I think those are some of great lessons. Let's just keep the conversation going. Look at the Budget Center's website for the PowerPoint advancement project. You know, we're always asking Mike to crunch some numbers for us, so they're happy to do that. And I want to kick it back to Joseph for any final things in terms of what you want to leave folks with.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you to all of our presenters today. Thank you guys in the audience as well on Webcast. So Chris, Mike, Veronica, Solomon, Lola, and Tammy, thank you guys for all your preparation on this. One quick note for anybody who did walk in a little bit late, I want to make sure that you guys get a chance to register with Yesenia, because the slides and all the materials and all of that will be available and sent out in email. So if you didn't get to register, then you won't get that information. Also make sure you do check in with Yesenia right here at the front before you leave. Just a very, very quick takeaway. Basically, the budget, Solomon mentioned this. He said the budget in the state has grown over 100%. And so the real question is, how do you get your share of it? And so you heard a lot of tools, you heard a lot of conversation around what does it take to engage in that process to shift the budget in your favor. If the resources have grown at such a dramatic rate and you're not seeing it for your constituencies, which that's been the case for most of us. You know, I mean, when I was doing work in organizing, I didn't see it grow for my constituencies. And so what do we do? You know, we talked about the tools today and the practices today that put us in a position to try to make those types of shifts, build those relationships, broaden your coalitions, deal with unlikely partners, tap into resources that, you know, you wouldn't have thought of on the front end. Research organizations like Cal Budget Center, Advancement Project, and others are great resources for our efforts. And you know, obviously there's a ton of work for us to get to do. So thank you guys for showing up in the rain and all. And I know that there's some food in the back here for you guys for lunch. And I think the folks on the panel are here for a few more minutes for questions if you have any particular questions you want to ask them. Thank you again.